There are 1.9 million housing units in Maricopa County. Single-family homes, apartments, mobile homes. Just under 600,000 of them are occupied by renters.
Everything looked great, everything seemed great.
People like Justin Clark, who moved to Phoenix in 2022. He was attracted to a brand new apartment complex in the downtown Phoenix area because of the location and the amenities.
It was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, and I believe it was around 740 square feet.
And how much did they charge for that?
So it came usually around to $2,100 to $2,200 a month.
That's not cheap.
No, especially coming from the Midwest.
Soon after moving in, Justin says he noticed problems with the plumbing, a shower floor that would not stop leaking. He ended up without a working bathroom.
I was without a shower in my apartment, and it was completely taped off for approximately 7 weeks.
This sounds like a nightmare.
Understatement.
Casey Gettinger has another nightmare story.
It was very grand when I first came in. Ritz-Carlton grand.
In 2022, Casey and her husband moved into one of the newer apartment towers that fill in the new Phoenix skyline. Luxury living at a luxury price, $3,100 per month for a 1-bedroom apartment. Do you feel like you got the value for what you were paying for?
No, I would just think that a building charging this month would have the money to put an AC in my building.
She says the air conditioning did not work.
How do you not have the staff to make sure that I have AC?
Both Casey and Justin say they thought by paying a little more in rent, they would get better service. Both say that is not how it worked out. It turns out the same large investment firm owns both of their apartment buildings. Greystar owns more apartments than any other company in the United States. It operates dozens in the Phoenix area, and it's just one of a growing number of institutional investors and private equity firms that have bought up and built rental units in our community. What has followed is a dramatic increase in rent. In 2018, the majority of renters in Maricopa County paid between $500 and $1,500 per month. In 2023, the majority paid between $1,500 and $2,500 per month.
We've seen it very clearly where a private equity firm buys a building and then immediately increases the rent. Definitely, that's their business model.
Jordan Ash is the housing director for an organization called the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. He studies the effects big investors have on the housing market.
They see an opportunity to raise rents or to add on fees or to spend less on maintenance and repairs.
Do you think that private equity has an outsized role in increasing rents in an entire community?
Absolutely. One company's rents affect another's.
9 of the nation's largest landlords are now operating in the Phoenix area. And you might think that would spark some healthy competition for renters, maybe even reducing rent prices. But according to this lawsuit filed by Arizona's Attorney General Chris Mays, the opposite has happened.
This is flat out cheating.
May's lawsuit accuses the 9 investment firms of using a software company called RealPage to artificially set rent prices higher than the free market would otherwise set them.
It spits out a price, and all of those landlords are asked to stick to that price. No one is allowed to go beneath it, because that, of course, would ruin their scheme.
They're agreeing behind the scenes to not drop their rents even when they have vacancies.
It's the modern day equivalent of a smoke-filled backroom deal between landlords where they're agreeing to charge high prices. And we passed antitrust laws in this state and in this country for precisely this reason.
In court documents, attorneys for RealPage state May's lawsuit advances an implausible theory and contains demonstrably false allegations. Justin Clark is also suing Greystar. In court paperwork, attorneys for Greystar write, the delays in finishing the repairs to Justin's shower were due to Justin filing a complaint for alleged code violations. Casey now lives in a rental home with a local landlord. In your experience, you found that the local landlord who just has a couple of rentals is a better landlord?
Completely, because they actually treat you like a person.
We want to welcome everybody inside the Arizona's Family Newsroom. I'm Derek Staahl alongside Morgan Loew with the special digital-only coverage, diving into this really big story here of housing and affordability in our state. And Morgan, I want to start kind of big picture. You're highlighting the problem of corporate landlords. A lot of times when we hear from economists, when we talk about housing affordability, they talk about our lack of housing in general. So help us understand, how much blame can we place on corporate landlords and the problem there, and the lack of housing in general?
Yeah, certainly these landlords probably would have a harder time doing what they are accused of doing if there was an abundance of housing. But the fact of the matter is, we've heard for years, the housing prices have gone, the rent prices have all gone up because there's such a shortage.
Right.
And what we're hearing here is, that might be part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And what we're seeing here is, if you believe the Attorney General's lawsuit, 70% of the large investment firms that own a lot of apartment complexes in the Valley have joined forces and have just using this company that behind the scenes is setting rent prices higher than the market would otherwise allow. And so that's not a housing shortage thing. That's what they would call a collusion thing.
You're saying 70% of the rentals in the Phoenix area are controlled by these companies that are all using this one system. It's called RealPage. Help us understand what RealPage is and how it works behind the scenes.
Yeah, RealPage has been around for almost 20 years, and it's this software company that basically figures out what the general price is in the marketplace. What are apartments going for, this type of apartment versus that type of apartment. And so it's really a genius piece of software, because it allows, in theory, a apartment complex to say, what's the market charging for these apartments? And okay, so we're in line now for what the market charges. I think the problem is, after listening to the Attorney General, reading the complaint, is that RealPage now represents and is used by so many of these large apartment complexes that it's no longer, if you believe the Attorney General, they're no longer just telling you what the market supports. They're telling you what the market should charge, and they are setting the market price.
Right, and I think in the story, if I heard the Attorney General right, I think she said no one is allowed to drop the prices. I mean, is there some sort of agreement that companies have to agree to when they sign up to use this service, that they will set the prices according to what the algorithm spits out? Yeah,
there are incentives, and there are also things that happen that are bad if a company does not abide by the contract. With RealPage, and that does appear to violate the state's Consumer Fraud Act and the state's antitrust laws, which basically says if you are competing companies, you can't agree behind the scenes about what you're going to charge. Competing companies should compete, and the beneficiary of that competition is not only the consumer, because they get a better deal, but it's also the companies, because some of them will make more money on their own merits, not because of some agreement that they've made behind closed doors about what they're going to charge.
And it's fascinating that so many companies are using this one particular software. On the flip side, today we got some news about another lawsuit involving a very similar topic. This one is actually from the feds, the Federal Trade Commission, and it's involving a company called Invitation Homes. Bring us up to speed on that.
Yeah, we've done stories on Invitation Homes for a couple of years now. Invitation Homes was a subsidiary of BlackRock. They were owned by a private equity firm for a long time, and then it spun off and is now a publicly traded corporation. It is the largest corporate owner of single-family homes in the country, and also the largest corporate owner of single-family homes in the Phoenix area. Invitation Homes buys homes and hangs on to them for the long term and rents them out. And they're the biggest. They've also had a lot of complaints. And so over the years, renters have complained that they get these fees that they were not aware of every month, or they aren't getting their security deposits back, or in some cases they complain about maintenance and that kind of thing, and it doesn't get fixed by the company. So the Federal Trade Commission started investigating Invitation Homes about 3 years ago, I believe, and today they announced they had come to this agreement. Invitation Homes
Admitted no wrongdoing.
Exactly, that's the phrase. They admitted no wrongdoing, but they set aside $48 million that is going to go to the Federal Trade Commission. And so if you were an Invitation Homes renter over the last few years and you were wondering why you didn't get your security deposit back, or you're curious about some fee that you incurred that you don't believe you should have had, this is money that could make it back into your pocket.
That's huge. One thing you mentioned, Invitation Homes buys single-family homes and they hold on to them. That's a business structure that I think is important when you go back to the context of these corporate landlords, the Gray Stars and the other ones.
Right.
Those are private equity companies. For those of us who did not take finance in college, can you remind us what a private equity company does and how their sort of modus operandi might be at play here?
Yeah, and it might be a little different. Like an Invitation Homes was private equity before, but they have hung on to most of these houses. Their idea is we're going to hang on to the house and we're going to rent them out for the long term. And the goal is to keep as many people in those homes as possible because the company then makes more money. When you look at a private equity private equity firm, they are bringing private money into a business, and they're identifying businesses that they think they can make more profitable. You know, theoretically,
they're flippers.
Right?
They're basically flippers.
Yeah, but they go in. Maybe they think we have better management, we can bring costs down, and then they sell the property in 3 to 5 years. And so private equity has really spent a lot of time focusing on real estate. You know, real estate, it makes money. They can park the assets there. So in some of these situations, like with using RealPage, in some cases, the Attorney General says that they're charging more money for rent for an apartment and losing some tenants.
Right. They're empty units.
Right. So it might not make sense, but if you're looking at it from the point of view of a company that says, we're only going to hold on to this property for 3 to 5 years, their modus operandi is to go in and make it appear as profitable as possible, which means charge more per apartment, even though there are some that are vacant that wouldn't otherwise be vacant. So this makes perfect sense if you approach it from that mindset.
Yes, interesting. So yeah, the private equity firms, they want to make those books look as attractive as possible for the next buyer who's going to come in. Absolutely fascinating. You had an extended conversation with the Attorney General, with Chris Mays. Let's go ahead and play that. It's fascinating.
What we discovered and what we allege in our lawsuit is that 9 of the biggest landlords in the state of Arizona are colluding with a software company called RealPage to artificially set high rents for literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Arizonans. And that is old-fashioned price fixing using new technology. And it is illegal under both state and federal antitrust laws and our Consumer Fraud Act.
When you read this, you get the idea that these companies are cheating.
They are cheating. I mean, this is flat out cheating. You are not allowed under the law to collude with one another to deprive Arizonans of lower rent. And the whole idea of a free market is that we have competition, right? That we assume in a free market that companies will compete with one another. And as a renter, you have a right to assume that when you walk into an apartment complex, that apartment complex is not colluding with the guy next door to set the same high price. What you ought to be able to assume in a free market economy is that both of those landlords are competing with one another. And that's not happening in Arizona. And that is a scandal. And, you know, it's just outrageous that we have seen the rise of these very powerful out-of-state corporate landlords who are now engaged in what is essentially cheating, that when you get to the bottom of it, really, really harms consumers and renters. And this is a state that where we have an increasing housing shortage, you know, and we have a lot of young people who are in the middle of their careers, or or folks who are retired who want to rent or have to rent. And they should not be subjected to this kind of collusion between landlords.
They might tell you that we're using this company because we're setting a fair price. Is that what you've seen?
No. And I mean, people, there's a reason that this lawsuit is the one lawsuit that most people want to talk to me about. This has really resonated with Arizonans because Arizonans know that they're paying a lot in rent these days. You know, $2,000, $2,500, $3,000 a month just for an apartment, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom apartment. And so it's something that people are feeling and seeing in their everyday lives. And no, they don't feel like they're getting a fair deal. I think what they didn't realize was that there was a reason they weren't getting a fair deal. And it's that these corporate entities are engaging in collusion with one another to keep that rent high. And what they were doing, and what they are doing, is they are using this software, which has an algorithm, and that algorithm collects data from all of these landlords about all of their units, about the location, about previous rents charged, about square footage, etc. And it spits out a price. And all of those landlords are asked to stick to that price. No one is allowed to go beneath it, because that, of course, would ruin their scheme. And it's a scheme.
They're agreeing behind the scenes to not drop their rents even when they have vacancies.
Yeah, I mean, the algorithm and the agreement is the modern day equivalent of a backroom smoke-filled deal. You know, it's the modern day equivalent of a smoke-filled backroom deal between landlords where they're agreeing to charge high prices. And we passed antitrust laws in this state and in this country for precisely this reason. And we passed consumer fraud laws to prevent that kind of thing. And so, you know, that's why we filed that lawsuit. And I think that's why, you know, you have federal interest now in this as well, because these landlords are doing this in other states.
When we've done stories on rent prices in the past, we get economists that will come on and they will say, this is the market. There's a shortage, so the prices have gone up. It seems to me like you're saying they left something out.
They left a big chunk of the story out. This is not just about a housing shortage. Do we have a housing shortage? Sure. You know, we need more. We need more apartments. We need more housing. We have a lot of people moving to Arizona. But we also have a lot of apartment units that are empty. Why? Because what's happening is these landlords would rather have those units be empty and still be able to charge everyone a very high rate than bring their rents down and have all of their units rented out. I mean, we have a whole bunch of units, apartment units in Phoenix that are empty in these apartment complexes that are engaged in this scheme, because for them, it doesn't really matter. What matters is being able to charge the highest rent possible. And that is outrageous. I mean, when you really think about it, This is truly one of the most outrageous schemes that Arizona has ever faced.
He's Morgan Loew. I'm Derek Staahl with this special Arizona's Family Investigates coverage on housing affordability in our state. Bring us up to speed on where we are right now. Are companies still using this software as we speak to set prices?
They are using RealPage. It is still a business. It is still in business. And as far as we know, the 9 companies that Attorney General Mays has named in this lawsuit are still using that. And that's, she alleges, 70% of the corporate landlords in the Phoenix area.
And so where are we in terms of this lawsuit, and what does the timeline look like on when there could be some resolution?
So this lawsuit was just filed at the beginning of the summer, and lawsuits like this could go on for years. However, there have been some developments, and that is that the U.S. Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission have also filed similar lawsuits against RealPage and some of these landlords. So it does appear that this movement to identify this as something that shouldn't be happening is catching on. And the Federal Trade Commission, as we reported earlier, just came out with an agreement with another corporate landlord, the Invitation Homes, and Invitation Homes settled that, agreed to an agreement. And that took, I think, 3 years for it to get to that point. So, I mean, I think we're looking at a number of years. Now, if you're an Invitation Homes customer and you want to get some of that money back, you feel you were wronged, that money from their agreement is going to the Federal Trade Commission fairly soon. So those payouts will be available pretty quickly. The Arizona Attorney General wants to hear from people who are or were customers, renters of these 9 corporate landlords, Greystar and some of the other ones, in case they get to a settlement or win this case. But that could be a couple of years down the road.
Staying on the FTC lawsuit and Invitation Homes for just a moment, one of our viewers, I think, posted a comment on our social media channels asking about fees that are imposed by landlords, saying, you know, some of these fees, where are they coming from? They seem awful greedy. Fees, if I'm not mistaken, were an aspect of that FTC lawsuit, and they got busted for charging. How did that work?
Yeah, so these are fees that are not apparent to a reasonable renter. It could be no grace period in the rent. You know, normally you have a day or two at least to get your rent in, and these are fees. It could be a fee because you didn't keep up some aspect of the property, but these were fees that really added up and caught the FTC's attention. And reading their agreement with Invitation Homes, you get the idea that if you are a landlord and you are going to be charging fees that are above and beyond what the rent is, they have to be clear. Everybody has to know about them and know what the rules are, so that they're not caught, you know, sort of by surprise, especially when we have such a large percentage of our renters out there who are paying a large percentage of their paycheck that goes to rent. If you add a $75 fee or a $100 fee every month, you know, that is real money that is being taken out of their pockets that they're already struggling to make ends meet without paying that.
Yeah, so it sounds like, unfortunately, fees are part of the business, but if landlords go too far, if they hide the fees, if they're unreasonable, regulators do show an appetite of going after these landlords. The other thing I want to talk about is we're seeing these lawsuits, we're seeing regulators come in and try to change the industry through lawsuits, but are there other solutions to Arizona's housing affordability problem?
Yeah, and one of the things that I've asked everybody who we interviewed over the course of doing this story and some others that we did is, what is the solution here? If you view the fact that these giant investment firms are coming in and buying thousands of homes or dozens or hundreds of apartment units, what is the solution? And then they have an outsized role in raising the rents to the point where they are now, which is very difficult for people to pay. How do you fix that? And you hear some people on the left talking about rent controls. It's a phrase that is just not incredibly popular among the mainstream. And then you hear on the other side, you hear them on the right saying, we just need to make it easier for developers to build more homes. And I'm not sure that that is really the solution to the problem. One of the solutions that I've heard that is very interesting is you get back to the main reason that these giant firms started buying up these properties is because you get tax incentives. You get tax breaks for property. Now, if this is your primary home, you get a bigger tax break. But if you have another home, a vacation home, an investment firm, those also provide you with some tax breaks. So looking at those second, third, fourth, however many properties and making a decision about how after a certain number, the tax break isn't going to be there, or it's not going to be the same. And that number, it may not be 5, it may not even be 100, but it's certainly not 5,000 homes. And so that is something that policymakers really are taking a look at, and it's going to be difficult to figure out how to quantify it, where that number should be. It's also kind of difficult because you look at a company like Invitation Homes. That's the corporate name. But here in Arizona, I have a notepad that has like 20 sub LLCs that are actually the owners of the property.
Okay.
Yeah, and so how do you police that this company, especially if it's private equity?
If you set a cap and say you're not allowed to buy more than 500 homes, they'll just break apart their entities and have one small entity buy 499, etc.
Exactly, and so that could be difficult to police. The reason we know Invitation Homes is because it's a publicly traded company, so they have SEC filings. We're able to see which LLCs they own, but if you're private equity, you don't have those filings because it's private money. And so, you know, there's not a real simple solution here, but there are some solutions. And policymakers really need to start looking at this, because this is the big problem here. When you raise rents $1,000 in 5 years, that's $1,000 every month that a family is not going to be spending on going out to dinner or saving for college or just doing what they need to do to have a good lifestyle. That money is being pulled out of our community and into the, you know, pockets on Wall Street, these big investors. And that doesn't really help our community.
Right. So many of these businesses are out of state. It's fascinating to get to talk to you in the format like this, because it shows how much reporting goes into a story like this. When we only see 2 or 3 minutes of it on the air, we could really dive in deep in a digital format like this. Morgan Loew, thank you so much. I want to remind everyone, we have more housing coverage, a huge topic here in our state. Join us tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. on Good Morning Arizona, on Arizona's Family, on traditional TV. Our Susan Casper is going to be diving in deep into...
Susan Campbell.
Sorry, Susan Campbell. Susan Casper is another great
also
reporter. Yes,
here.
Susan Campbell, thank you. Susan Campbell is going to be talking about what people who were renters of Invitation Homes, what they can do to try to recoup some of the money that has now been awarded to the FTC, and hopefully we can get some people paid back who were hit with improper junk fees or hidden fees or things like that. So that's tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. on Good Morning Arizona. For Morgan, for myself, for Jason running the buttons, and everybody here, thanks so much for watching.